The chef told the cooking class my recipe was an amateur mistake that violated basic culinary principles. I'm the Michelin-starred chef who invented the dish. I was sitting in the back row of Chef Damien Rousseau's recreational cooking class at the Brooklyn Culinary Institute wearing a baseball cap and glasses I didn't need, trying to stay invisible. My name is Julian Cross, and I'd held 3 Michelin stars at my Manhattan restaurant Vesper for 8 consecutive years before I sold it 6 months ago to take a break from the relentless pressure of maintaining perfection. The break had turned into an identity crisis where I couldn't figure out who I was without the stars and the accolades and the constant performance. My therapist suggested taking a cooking class as a student instead of an instructor, experiencing food from a different perspective. So I'd enrolled under my middle name, Julian Renfield, paying cash for a 6-week recreational course that promised to teach home cooks advanced techniques. I hadn't expected the 3rd week's menu to include my signature dish, charred octopus with black garlic emulsion and citrus gel, the recipe that had put Vesper on the culinary map and had been featured in every major food publication. Rousseau stood at the front of the teaching kitchen holding up a printed recipe sheet, and I felt my stomach drop when I saw it was a near-exact copy of my original formula, the one I'd spent 18 months perfecting. He announced to the class of 12 students that today they'd be learning a popular dish from a trendy Manhattan restaurant, though he added with a dismissive wave that the original chef had clearly prioritized appearance over flavor and had made several fundamental errors that violated basic culinary principles. I gripped the edge of my stainless steel workstation and tried to keep my expression neutral. Rousseau started his lecture by holding up an octopus tentacle and explaining the proper technique for tenderizing and cooking it. The original recipe calls for a 3-stage cooking process: pressure cooking, ice bath, then high-heat searing. That's unnecessarily complicated and frankly shows the chef didn't understand the protein structure of octopus. He walked between the stations, his chef's coat pristine white, his voice carrying that particular authority that comes from years of teaching people who don't know enough to question him. We're going to simplify this by just boiling the octopus in salted water with aromatics, then searing it. The result will be more tender and flavorful than the original version, which tends to be rubbery and overcooked. Several students nodded and took notes, accepting his expertise without question. I'd developed my 3-stage technique specifically to achieve the perfect texture, crispy on the outside, while maintaining tenderness inside. The method had been featured in Culinary Science Quarterly, with supporting research from food scientists at MIT. Rousseau was about to teach everyone in this room to make an inferior version while claiming he was improving on my work. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for my knife, and I told myself to stay quiet, to just observe and leave, to not make this personal. But it was personal because this dish represented 2 years of my life and countless failures before I'd gotten it right. Rousseau moved to the black garlic emulsion, which was the heart of the dish, the component that had taken me 9 months to perfect. He held up a jar of pre-made black garlic paste and said, "The original recipe insists on fermenting your own black garlic over 3 weeks in a controlled environment. That's pretentious chef nonsense. Store-bought black garlic paste works perfectly fine and saves you weeks of unnecessary work." He demonstrated blending the paste with olive oil and lemon juice, creating a thin, broken emulsion that separated immediately. My version required slow incorporation of aged black garlic. I fermented myself with specific temperature and humidity controls, combined with a neutral oil and an emulsifier to create a stable, velvety sauce. The difference wasn't pretension, it was chemistry and flavor development. I watched him serve the broken sauce to students as an example and felt anger building in my chest. A woman next to me named Leah whispered, "This is so much easier than I expected from reading about this dish online. I always thought it seemed too complicated for home cooks." I wanted to explain that complexity served a purpose, that shortcuts had consequences, but I just nodded and focused on my own station. Rousseau assigned us to work in pairs, and I ended up with Leah, who was enthusiastic but clearly inexperienced, gripping her knife wrong and cutting vegetables with no consistency. I gently showed her the proper technique, and she thanked me, saying, "You seem to know what you're doing. Have you cooked professionally?" I told her I'd worked in restaurants years ago, which was technically true, and helped her prep her ingredients. When we started cooking the octopus using Russo's simplified method, I followed his instructions exactly, documenting every step mentally while my professional instincts screamed that this was wrong. The boiled octopus came out pale and waterlogged, the texture exactly what I'd spent months trying to avoid. When we seared it, the exterior didn't develop the proper caramelization because there was too much residual moisture. The black garlic emulsion remained separated and oily, coating the octopus in an unappetizing slick rather than a smooth sauce. The citrus gel, which Russo had us make with grocery store gelatin instead of the agar-agar I specified, was rubbery and artificial tasting. The final plated dish looked vaguely similar to my original but tasted fundamentally different. The flavors muddy and unbalanced, the textures all wrong. Russo walked around tasting everyone's versions and praised them all, saying, "This is what the dish should taste like when it's made properly, instead of being overcomplicated by a chef trying to justify expensive menu prices." Leah tasted hers and said it was delicious, and I watched other students photograph their plates and presumably post them to social media with tags about learning this famous dish. They were all eating and celebrating an inferior version while believing they'd learned the real thing, and the chef teaching them was actively undermining my work while profiting from teaching a bastardized version of my recipe. I raised my hand, and Russo acknowledged me with a slight nod, clearly not recognizing me beneath the cap and glasses. I kept my voice neutral and asked, "What if the three-stage cooking process in the original recipe serves a specific purpose? The pressure cooking breaks down connective tissue differently than boiling, and the ice bath stops the cooking process precisely to prevent that rubbery texture you mentioned." Russo smiled in that patient way teachers use when correcting someone who doesn't understand. That's a common misconception perpetuated by trendy restaurant cooking. Traditional methods like boiling have been used for centuries because they work. These modern techniques are more about theater than results. He moved to the board and drew a diagram showing protein structure, explaining why his method was superior using terminology that sounded scientific but was actually incorrect. I could see students accepting his authority, writing down his explanations in their notebooks. A man named Derek at the station across from me asked, "So the chef who created this dish doesn't really know what he's doing?" Russo laughed and said, "Let's say he knows how to create an impressive presentation and charge $85 for a plate of octopus, but whether he understands the fundamental science of cooking is questionable. A lot of these celebrity chefs rely on technique over substance." The casual dismissal of my expertise, my years of training in France and Japan, my scientific approach to cooking that had earned me 3 Michelin stars, made my face hot with anger. After class ended, I stayed behind while other students filed out, discussing their dishes and planning to attempt them at home. Russo was cleaning his station when I approached and said, "Can I ask you something about the recipe?" He looked up with professional courtesy and said, "Of course, that's what I'm here for." I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo from Food and Wine magazine featuring my original version of the dish, the octopus charred to deep mahogany, the emulsion glossy and perfectly smooth, the citrus gel jewel-like and translucent. This is what the dish is supposed to look like. The version we made today doesn't match this quality. Don't you think the original chef's techniques might have been designed to achieve these specific results? Russo glanced at the photo and shrugged. Magazine photography is heavily styled and edited. That's not what the dish actually looks like in the restaurant. I've had it at Vesper, and it's decent, but not worth the hype or the price tag. The chef got lucky with good marketing and a few positive reviews, but technically the dish has significant flaws that I've corrected in my version. I felt something snap inside me. This man had not only stolen my recipe but was teaching it wrong while claiming to improve it, and he was doing it with such confidence that students believed him completely. I asked how long he'd been teaching this dish, and he said, "About 6 months. It's one of my most popular classes. Students love learning they can make expensive restaurant food at home without all the unnecessary complication." I left the cooking school and drove straight to my attorney's office in Midtown. Lawrence Finkelstein had handled my restaurant's legal matters for a decade, and when I explained the situation, he pulled up Russo's cooking school website and the course description advertising, "Learn to make famous NYC restaurant dishes with corrections from a professional chef." Lawrence clicked through pages showing Russo's credentials: culinary school graduate, former sous chef at several mid-tier restaurants, teaching certificate from the Culinary Education Institute. Nothing that would suggest he had the expertise to critique my technique. Lawrence asked if I'd trademark the dish name or publish the exact recipe anywhere, and I explained that while I'd given interviews about my cooking philosophy, I'd never published complete recipes. The dish itself couldn't be copyrighted, but if Russo was implying my technique was wrong to sell his classes, that might constitute defamation or false advertising. Lawrence said, "The challenge is proving damages. You sold Vesper, so you're not currently losing restaurant business. And cooking classes teaching restaurant dishes is common practice. Unless he's specifically naming you and making false claims about your competence, this might not be legally actionable." I told him about Russo's comments dismissing celebrity chefs as prioritizing theater over substance, and Lawrence made notes, but said, "That's still pretty vague. He never named you directly during the class?" I admitted he hadn't. But the implication was clear when he was teaching my signature dish while criticizing its original preparation method. Lawrence suggested documenting everything from future classes, getting statements from other students about what Russo said, and building a case if his teaching was damaging my professional reputation. But he warned that legal action would make this public, would require me to reveal I'd been attending the class undercover, and might generate negative publicity that could hurt worse than Russo's teaching ever would. "Sometimes the best revenge is creating something new that makes people forget about the old thing," he said, echoing advice I'd heard from mentors throughout my career. But I wasn't ready to let this go. That dish represented a specific moment in my culinary development. A breakthrough where everything clicked and I understood how to balance flavor, texture, and technique at the highest level. Having it taught poorly while being criticized as overcomplicated felt like watching someone vandalize a painting I'd spent years creating. I asked Lawrence to send Russo a cease and desist letter demanding he stop teaching the dish and stop making disparaging comments about its creator. Lawrence drafted something professionally threatening and sent it that afternoon. Russo's response came back through his own attorney within 24 hours. He had every right to teach cooking techniques in an educational setting. He'd never named me specifically, and if I wanted to pursue legal action, he'd countersue for harassment. His attorney included links to articles and reviews praising Russo's teaching style and his ability to demystify complicated restaurant cooking for home cooks. I spent the next week obsessing over the situation instead of addressing the actual crisis in my life, which was that I'd sold a successful restaurant because I'd burned out and now had no clear sense of purpose or direction. My ex-wife Simone called from Paris, where she'd moved after our divorce 3 years ago, and when I told her about Russo, she sighed and said, "Julian, you're fixating on this because it's easier than dealing with the real problem. You don't know who you are without the restaurant, without the constant validation of the stars and the reviews. Some random cooking instructor teaching your dish badly is not actually a threat to you." She was right, but admitting that meant confronting the void I'd been avoiding since selling Vesper. I'd thought taking time off would help me rediscover my passion for cooking, but instead I'd just felt lost, spending days watching cooking shows and critiquing them, going to restaurants and feeling disconnected from both the food and the experience. The cooking class had been my therapist, Dr. Nora Blackwell's idea to reconnect with food as a student, to remember what it felt like to learn instead of perform. But finding Russo teaching my dish badly had just given me a new target for the anxiety and anger I didn't know how to process. Dr. Blackwell asked during our next session why I cared so much about one person teaching one dish incorrectly, and I tried to explain that it wasn't about ego, it was about integrity, about the years of work being dismissed as pretentious theater. She wrote something in her notebook and asked, "Or is it about needing external validation that your work mattered, that you're still relevant even though you walked away?" I enrolled in Russo's next session of the same class under a different name, Julian Cross this time, using my real identity, but trusting that Russo wouldn't recognize a chef he'd probably only seen in carefully staged publicity photos from years ago. I wanted to document his teaching more thoroughly, to build evidence of exactly how he was misrepresenting my techniques. The class followed the same pattern. Russo introduced the charred octopus dish, explained that the original chef had overcomplicated it, demonstrated his simplified version while criticizing the original methodology. This time I recorded the entire session on my phone, capturing his exact words as he said, "Some chefs get so caught up in molecular gastronomy nonsense that they forget food is supposed to taste good. This dish is a perfect example where stripping away the pretentious technique actually improves the final result. He held up his broken emulsion and rubbery octopus as proof, and 12 new students accepted his authority without question. During the hands-on portion, I made the dish exactly according to Russo's specifications while mentally cataloging every deviation from my original recipe. The woman working next to me, an accountant named Priya, said she'd tried to make this dish at home once from an article she'd read online, but it had been too complicated and hadn't worked. "This version is so much more approachable," she said, tasting her pale, waterlogged octopus with apparent satisfaction. "I don't understand why restaurants make everything so difficult." After class, I approached Russo again and introduced myself as a food writer working on an article about cooking education. I asked if I could interview him about his teaching philosophy, and he agreed immediately, clearly pleased at the attention. We met the following week at a coffee shop in Park Slope, and I recorded the conversation with his permission, asking about his background, his approach to teaching, and his thoughts on contemporary restaurant cooking. Russo was charismatic and articulate, explaining how he'd become disillusioned with fine dining culture during his years working in high-end restaurants. "There's so much ego and pretension," he said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "Chefs treating food like art when it's really just craft, the obsession with technique and presentation over actual flavor and accessibility. I started teaching because I wanted to show people that restaurant cooking isn't magic, it's just cooking with an inflated price tag." He talked about demystifying specific dishes, about empowering home cooks to recreate expensive meals without the intimidation factor. When I asked specifically about the charred octopus dish, he launched into the same critique I'd heard in class. "That dish is a perfect case study in overcomplication. The chef clearly studied modernist cuisine and decided to apply every trendy technique, whether it improved the dish or not. Pressure cooking, specialized equipment, aged black garlic that takes weeks to ferment. None of it serves the actual eating experience. It's all performance for food critics and Instagram." I asked if he'd ever spoken to the original chef about their intentions behind the technique, and Russo laughed. "These celebrity chefs don't interact with cooking instructors. We exist in different worlds. But I don't need to talk to him to know the technique is flawed. I can taste the results, and I've cooked long enough to understand when complexity is justified versus when it's just showing off." He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of student dishes from his classes, all of them looking similar to what I'd made, all of them receiving enthusiastic praise in the comments. "This is real success," he said. "Making food accessible to regular people instead of gatekeeping it behind expensive equipment and trained technique." I asked how he felt about criticism that he might be teaching simplified versions that don't match the quality of the originals, and he dismissed it immediately. "Quality is subjective. If my students enjoy their versions and feel accomplished making them, that's what matters. The food world needs less elitism and more inclusion." I thanked him for his time and left the coffee shop with 90 minutes of recorded conversation where he'd systematically dismissed my expertise and approach while positioning himself as the voice of reason against pretentious fine dining. I had documentation now, clear evidence of what he was teaching and why. But Lawrence had been right that it wasn't legally actionable unless I could prove specific damages to my reputation or business. The breaking point came when I discovered Russo had published a cookbook called Restaurant Classics Made Right, Fixing Famous Dishes from NYC's Trendiest Kitchens. The book featured 50 recipes from various high-end restaurants, all presented with Russo's commentary about what was wrong with the originals and how he'd corrected them. My charred octopus dish was featured prominently in the seafood chapter with a full-page photo of Russo's version and 3 pages explaining why the original chef's technique was unnecessarily baroque and ultimately counterproductive. The book had been published by a mid-sized culinary press and was getting positive reviews from home cooking blogs and amateur food critics who appreciated Russo's approachable style and anti-elitist message. One review specifically praised his takedown of pretentious molecular gastronomy that prioritizes theater over taste. Another called him the voice of reason in a food world gone mad with complexity. The book was climbing bestseller lists in the cooking category, and Russo was scheduled for a promotional tour, including appearances on morning shows and food podcasts. He'd taken his criticism of my dish from a local cooking class to a national platform, and now thousands of people were reading his analysis of why my technique was flawed and his correction was superior. I called Lawrence back and showed him the book. This changed things because Russo had published specific, detailed criticism of my technique in a commercial product. Lawrence's expression shifted from sympathetic to professional as he read through the octopus chapter. This is potentially defamatory if we can prove his claims about your technique being wrong are false. Can you get expert witnesses who will testify that your original method is scientifically sound and his version is actually inferior? I told him I could get statements from food scientists, from other Michelin-starred chefs, from the critics who'd praised my dish when it first appeared. Lawrence started making a list of what we'd need to build a case: expert testimony about cooking technique, documentation of my professional credentials and achievements, evidence that Russo's claims were false and damaging to my reputation, proof that his book was profiting from those false claims. He warned that this would be expensive and time-consuming, that Russo would fight back with his own experts claiming his methods were valid alternatives, and that the case would generate significant media attention. Are you prepared for people to know you've been attending his cooking classes undercover? That's going to be part of this story. I told him I was prepared for whatever exposure came from defending my work and my expertise against someone systematically misrepresenting both. Lawrence filed a defamation lawsuit against Russo and his publisher 3 weeks later, seeking damages of $2 million for harm to my professional reputation and requesting that the book be pulled from sale pending correction of the false claims about my technique. The lawsuit detailed my credentials, including my 3 Michelin stars, my training under master chefs in France and Japan, my awards from culinary organizations, and the scientific validation of my pressure cooking technique. We included statements from Dr. Harold Levinson at MIT, who'd studied my method for his research on protein denaturation, from Chef Marie Toussaint, who held 2 Michelin stars and used similar techniques, and from food critic Jennifer Wu, who'd written extensively about how my dish had elevated American octopus preparations to new heights. The lawsuit alleged that Russo had knowingly published false information about my technique being flawed when his own simplified version produced objectively inferior results by any professional culinary standard. We included side-by-side photos of both versions with analysis from Dr. Levinson explaining why my 3-stage process achieved superior texture and flavor development. Russo's attorney responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing that cooking techniques couldn't be objectively right or wrong, that his book expressed legitimate opinions based on his professional experience, and that criticism of a public figure's work was protected speech. The motion included affidavits from several home cooks who'd tried Russo's version and preferred it to the more complicated original, arguing that simpler was better for most people. The lawsuit made national food news within days. Articles appeared in Eater, Food and Wine, and the New York Times food section discussing the case and the larger questions it raised about culinary expertise, recipe ownership, and the democratization of fine dining technique. Opinion pieces divided sharply. Some defended my right to protect my professional reputation against false claims. Others argued that Russo was performing a public service by making restaurant cooking accessible to regular people. A particularly scathing piece in a food blog called Me, the epitome of everything wrong with fine dining elitism, so insecure about my relevance after selling my restaurant that I'm suing a cooking instructor for teaching people how to make food at home. The article pointed out that I'd enrolled in Russo's class under false pretenses, essentially spying on him, which made me seem paranoid and vindictive. Food Twitter exploded with debates about whether chefs could claim ownership over techniques, whether simplified versions of dishes should be marketed as corrections, and whether my lawsuit was legitimate defense of expertise or abuse of power by someone with resources to silence criticism. Russo gave interviews positioning himself as David fighting Goliath, a working teacher being bullied by a wealthy former celebrity chef who couldn't handle being challenged. "I'm trying to educate people," he said on a food podcast. Julian Cross wants to gatekeep culinary knowledge behind expensive equipment and years of training. He doesn't believe regular people deserve access to restaurant-quality cooking. The media narrative was shifting against me despite the merit of my case, and I started getting angry messages on social media from people who viewed me as an elitist, trying to crush a teacher who was helping home cooks. One message said, You charged $85 for a plate of octopus, and now you're mad someone's teaching people how to make it for $15. You're the problem with food culture. Another said, Russo's book is helping thousands of people learn to cook. Your lawsuit is just ego and greed. My publicist, whom I'd retained despite no longer having a restaurant to promote, advised me to stop reading the comments and focus on the legal case. But the court of public opinion was turning against me, and even my friends in the industry were privately questioning whether this lawsuit was worth the damage it was doing to my reputation. Chef Thomas Brennan, who'd been my mentor early in my career, called and said, Julian, you're right about the technique, but this fight is making you look petty. Is being right worth becoming the villain in this story? I told him it wasn't about being right. It was about preventing someone from profiting off false claims about my work. He was quiet for a moment and then said, You sold Vesper because you were burnt out. Maybe this lawsuit is about trying to prove you still matter, that your work still has value, but you don't need to prove that to anyone except yourself. The preliminary hearing took place on a Friday morning in a Manhattan courthouse with Judge Barbara Northcott presiding. Lawrence presented our case systematically. My credentials, the scientific validation of my technique, the demonstrable inferiority of Russo's version, the false claims in his book. He showed video I'd recorded of Russo's class where he explicitly stated my technique was wrong and his was correct, not just different. He presented Dr. Levinson's analysis explaining why the pressure cooking method produced superior results in terms of texture, moisture retention, and flavor development. Judge Northcott listened carefully, asking detailed questions about culinary technique and whether cooking methods could be objectively evaluated. Russo's attorney, a sharp woman named Claire Hastings, argued that cooking was inherently subjective, that Russo had every right to critique published work and offer alternatives, and that my lawsuit was attempting to silence legitimate criticism through legal intimidation. She presented testimonials from Russo's students, praising his teaching and his book, arguing that thousands of people found value in his approach. She also pointed out that I'd sold my restaurant for a reported $8 million 6 months before filing this lawsuit, questioning whether my reputation had actually been damaged when I'd voluntarily left the industry. Judge Northcott took the arguments under consideration and scheduled a ruling for the following week. While waiting for the judge's decision, I received an unexpected email from Marcus Kenji, a food writer I'd known for years who'd written favorably about Vesper. He said he was working on a piece about the lawsuit for a major food magazine and wanted my perspective on the larger issues beyond the legal case. We met at a wine bar in the West Village, and Marcus asked questions that went deeper than the surface controversy. Why does this matter so much to you? You've got 3 Michelin stars on your record. You sold your restaurant for millions. You have nothing left to prove. Why are you spending your time and money fighting a cooking instructor over one dish? I tried to explain about integrity, about the years of work being dismissed as pretentious theater, about the principle of someone profiting from false claims. Marcus listened and then said, Here's what I think is really happening. You're angry at yourself for selling Vesper, for giving up something that defined you for so long. You're lost without the structure and validation of running a Michelin-starred restaurant. Russo became a convenient target for all that self-directed anger because it's easier to fight him than to face the real question of who you are now. His words hit harder than any of the negative social media comments because they were probably true. I'd been avoiding the fundamental crisis in my life by fixating on this external battle. Judge Northcott's ruling came down the following Wednesday. She was allowing the case to proceed to trial, finding that there were genuine factual disputes about whether Russo's claims in his book were false and whether they damaged my professional reputation. But she also included a pointed comment in her written decision noting that, while the plaintiff has established credentials to claim expertise in culinary technique, he must prove that the defendant's alternative approach is not merely different, but demonstrably false, and that such false claims caused measurable harm to the plaintiff's professional standing. The ruling gave me a legal victory, but set a high bar for what I'd need to prove at trial. Russo's response was to double down on his position, giving interviews where he said, The judge's ruling proves that cooking technique is subjective. Julian Cross can't just declare his way is the only right way. This case is going to expose fine dining elitism for what it is, chefs protecting their territory instead of sharing knowledge. His publisher announced they were standing behind the book and Russo, and sales actually increased following the publicity from the lawsuit. The book climbed into the top 10 on several bestseller lists, driven by people who viewed buying it as a statement against culinary elitism. I'd sued to protect my reputation and instead had created a situation where Russo was more successful than ever, while I was widely portrayed as a bully. The discovery phase of the lawsuit required me to produce documentation of my technique development, my recipe testing, my communications with food scientists, essentially laying bare the entire creative process behind my signature dish. Lawrence warned that Russo's attorneys would use this to argue I was trying to claim ownership over ideas that should be public knowledge, that culinary techniques couldn't be proprietary. Meanwhile, Russo was required to produce documentation of his recipe development, his testing of different methods, his credentials to critique my technique. What emerged from discovery was illuminating. Russo had never actually pressure-cooked octopus before writing his book, had never tested whether his simplified version produced comparable results to mine, had based his entire critique on theoretical assumptions about cooking rather than empirical testing. His notes from developing the recipes in his book showed he'd started with a basic boiled octopus recipe and simply declared it better than mine without doing comparative tastings or scientific analysis. Dr. Levinson reviewed Russo's methodology and provided a scathing assessment. Mr. Russo's approach lacks any scientific rigor. He assumes that simpler methods must produce better results without testing that assumption. His critique of Chef Cross's technique is not based on evidence, but on ideology about how cooking should be done. This was exactly the ammunition we needed to prove Russo's claims were false, not just different opinions. Armed with this discovery material, Lawrence scheduled depositions where both Russo and I would be questioned under oath about our respective techniques and credentials. Russo's deposition took place first, in a conference room at his attorney's office, with court reporters documenting every word. Claire Hastings tried to keep the questions focused on Russo's teaching credentials and his right to critique published techniques, but Lawrence systematically demolished Russo's expertise. He established that Russo had never worked in a Michelin-starred restaurant, had never received formal training in molecular gastronomy or modernist technique, had never published peer-reviewed research on cooking science. When Lawrence asked if Russo had ever actually tasted my original version of the dish at Vesper, Russo admitted he'd never eaten there because it was too expensive. He'd based his entire critique on reading about the dish and looking at photos. Lawrence asked, "So when you wrote in your book that Chef Cross's technique is unnecessarily baroque and ultimately counterproductive, you hadn't actually tasted the results of his technique?" Russo's face reddened as he said, "I didn't need to taste it to understand that pressure cooking octopus is overcomplicating a simple process." Lawrence pressed further. "Did you conduct any comparative testing between your simplified method and Chef Cross's original technique? Did you prepare both versions and evaluate them side by side?" Russo admitted he hadn't, that he'd relied on his understanding of cooking principles to conclude his version would be superior. My deposition took place the following week, and Claire Hastings was aggressive in trying to establish that I was motivated by ego rather than legitimate professional harm. She asked about my decision to sell Vesper, whether I'd been struggling with burnout, whether I'd been seeking new ways to feel relevant after leaving the restaurant industry. She introduced social media posts I'd made during my restaurant years, showing me at industry events, accepting awards, posing with other celebrity chefs, trying to paint me as someone obsessed with status and recognition. She asked, "Isn't it true that you enrolled in Mr. Russo's cooking class under a false name because you were looking for ways to criticize him? That you went there with the intention of finding fault?" I explained that I'd enrolled as part of therapy to reconnect with cooking from a student's perspective, that discovering Russo teaching my dish incorrectly had been genuinely surprising. She asked, "But you continued attending classes even after discovering this supposed misrepresentation. You recorded Mr. Russo without his knowledge. You interviewed him under false pretenses claiming to be a food writer. Doesn't that suggest you were building a case against him rather than simply defending your reputation?" I had to admit that once I'd discovered the situation, I'd documented it deliberately, but I explained that documentation was necessary to prove the harm being done. Claire smiled and said, "Or to build leverage for a lawsuit because you were angry that someone dared to question your techniques." The most damaging part of my deposition came when Claire asked about the financial implications of the lawsuit. She established that I'd sold Vesper for $8.2 million, that I had no current restaurant or business that could be harmed by Russo's teaching, that I was essentially retired from the industry. "So how exactly has your professional reputation been damaged?" she asked. "You're not seeking work as a chef. You're not operating a restaurant. You're not selling products or services that would be affected by Mr. Russo's book. This lawsuit isn't about protecting a business interest. It's about protecting your ego, isn't it?" I tried to explain that professional reputation mattered beyond immediate financial interests, that I might want to open another restaurant or consult or write my own cookbook, and Russo's false claims would affect my ability to do any of that credibly. But Claire had made her point. Without a current business to protect, proving measurable damages would be difficult. The deposition lasted 6 hours and left me exhausted and questioning whether this lawsuit had been a mistake. That evening, I met with Lawrence at his office, and he was honest about our chances. "The discovery helps us prove Russo's claims are false, but Claire is right that proving damages is going to be harder than I initially thought. Without a current business, we're asking the jury to award damages based on potential future harm to your reputation. That's a tough sell, especially when Russo's supporters are going to argue you're just trying to silence legitimate criticism." 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Russo's publisher reached out through Lawrence with a settlement offer. They would add a disclaimer to future editions of the book, acknowledging that Russo's versions were simplified alternatives rather than corrections of flawed techniques. They would remove the specific language calling my technique unnecessarily baroque and ultimately counterproductive, and they would pay $50,000 toward my legal fees. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and agree not to pursue further legal action. Lawrence said, "It's not the full vindication you wanted, but it gets the false claims removed and saves you the uncertainty of trial. Trials are expensive and unpredictable, and Claire did damage during depositions that could influence a jury." I asked what he honestly thought our chances were at trial, and Lawrence said, 60-40 in our favor on proving the claims are false, but maybe 50-50 on getting meaningful damages. You could spend $200,000 on trial costs and end up with a judgment that doesn't cover your expenses. The pragmatic choice was to take the settlement, claim a partial victory, and move on with my life. But pragmatism felt like defeat, like allowing Russo to get away with building his career on misrepresenting my work as long as he softened the language slightly. I told Lawrence I wanted to proceed to trial. He made a note on his legal pad and said, "Then we need to focus on the one thing that could win this case definitively. Proving that your version of the dish is objectively superior to Russo's in a way that's demonstrable to a jury." Lawrence suggested we request a cooking demonstration as part of the trial, where both Russo and I would prepare our respective versions of the dish and have them evaluated by expert witnesses and the jury. Claire Hastings objected strenuously, arguing that cooking was performance art and couldn't be fairly evaluated in a courtroom setting. But Judge Northcott was intrigued by the idea and ruled that it would be allowed. She scheduled a special session where we would each prepare the charred octopus dish in a demonstration kitchen set up in the courthouse, with Dr. Arl Levinson and 2 other culinary experts evaluating the results, alongside jury members who would taste both versions. The session would be videotaped, and the experts would explain what they were evaluating in terms of technique, flavor, and texture. This was unprecedented in a culinary lawsuit, and media coverage intensified with headlines about the cook-off trial and speculation about whether cooking could be objectively judged. I spent the week before the demonstration practicing my technique obsessively, treating it like I was preparing for a Michelin inspection. My hands shook slightly as I pressure-cooked octopus in my home kitchen, panic rising that I'd somehow forgotten how to execute my own signature dish. Dr. Blackwell asked during our emergency session whether I was more afraid of losing the case or of discovering that maybe Russo's version was adequate, that my elaborate technique wasn't necessary. "What if the jury prefers his simpler version?" she asked. "What if this demonstration proves that your work wasn't as special as you believed?" The demonstration took place on a Monday morning in a courthouse conference room that had been transformed into a functional kitchen with portable burners, refrigeration units, and workstations for both of us. Judge Northcott, the jury, attorneys for both sides, and 3 culinary experts sat at tables arranged to observe both stations. Cameras documented everything for the court record. Russo and I were each given identical ingredients and 3 hours to prepare our respective versions of the dish. We worked in silence with only the sounds of knives on cutting boards, burners igniting, pans sizzling. I fell into the rhythm of my technique with muscle memory taking over. Octopus into the pressure cooker with aromatics and wine, exactly 25 minutes at high pressure, immediate ice bath to stop carryover cooking, careful drying before searing. The black garlic I'd fermented myself for 3 weeks was incorporated into neutral oil with a hand blender at precisely calibrated speeds to create a stable emulsion. The citrus gel required agar-agar bloomed in juice, then heated to activate, cooled to just the right temperature for the perfect wobble. Every step was deliberate, practiced thousands of times over the years I'd spent perfecting this dish. Across from me, Russo worked through his simplified version. Octopus boiled in salted water with aromatics, seared while still wet, store-bought black garlic paste mixed with olive oil, citrus gel made with standard gelatin. His technique was faster, required less equipment, and was undeniably more accessible to home cooks. But accessibility had never been the goal of my dish. The goal had been perfection. The expert panel evaluated both dishes systematically, with Dr. Levinson explaining the science of what we were observing. He cut into my octopus with a knife and described the interior texture. Chef Cross's pressure cooking method has broken down the connective tissue evenly throughout the octopus while maintaining moisture. The exterior sear created Maillard reactions that add complex flavors without overcooking the interior. The contrast between the charred exterior and tender interior is precisely controlled. He cut into Russo's version and noted, the boiling method has made the octopus generally tender, but there's inconsistency in the texture, with some areas remaining tough. The exterior sear didn't develop as fully because excess moisture prevented proper caramelization. The overall texture is pleasant, but not refined. The other experts provided similar assessments, with chef evaluations focusing on the black garlic emulsion. My version was smooth, stable, and coated the octopus evenly, providing a rich background flavor that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the seafood. Russo's broken emulsion pooled on the plate and tasted predominantly of raw olive oil with only muted black garlic flavor. The citrus gel comparison was equally stark. Mine had a delicate texture and bright flavor that provided acid balance, while Russo's was rubbery and tasted artificial. The jury members tasted both versions and were asked to provide written evaluations based on flavor, texture, and overall balance. Dr. Levinson compiled the results. 11 of 12 jurors preferred my version significantly, noting superior texture, better flavor integration, and more sophisticated overall execution. Claire Hastings tried to argue during closing arguments that jury preference didn't prove Russo's claims were false, only that my technique produced results some people liked better. But Lawrence countered with the expert testimony and the documented juror preferences. The evidence is clear that Chef Cross's technique produces objectively superior results by every professional culinary standard. Mr. Russo claimed in his book that Chef Cross's method was unnecessarily baroque and ultimately counterproductive. We've proven that claim is false. The 3-stage cooking process produces demonstrably better texture and flavor. The homemade black garlic fermentation creates a more stable and flavorful emulsion. The agar-agar gel has superior texture to standard gelatin. Mr. Russo didn't just offer a different opinion, he made factually false claims about professional technique in order to sell his book and his classes. That's defamation. And Chef Cross's reputation has been damaged by thousands of people reading those false claims. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict. They found in my favor on the defamation claim, awarding $400,000 in damages. They also issued an injunction requiring Russo's publisher to remove the false claims from the book and issue a correction in future editions. It was a complete victory legally, but as I sat in the courtroom hearing the verdict, I felt empty rather than triumphant. I'd won the battle, but lost something harder to define in the process. The aftermath of the trial was complicated. Media coverage was split between celebrating my vindication and criticizing the resources I'd spent defending my culinary ego. Russo gave interviews claiming the verdict was proof that the legal system favored wealthy celebrity chefs over working teachers, that I'd used my money and connections to silence him. His book was pulled from major retailers pending the corrections, and his cooking school saw enrollment drop as the publicity turned negative. I'd proven I was right about the technique, but I'd also confirmed every criticism about fine dining elitism and gatekeeping. Dr. Blackwell asked during our session after the verdict, "Do you feel better now? Did winning the case give you what you needed?" I told her honestly that I didn't know. The validation of having my technique proven superior hadn't filled the void left by selling Vesper. Chef Brennan called and said, "You won the case, Julian, but you lost the larger battle. People remember you now as the chef who sued a cooking instructor, not as the chef who earned 3 Michelin stars." He was right. I'd let anger and wounded pride drive me into a public battle that had diminished my reputation more than Rousseau's book ever could have. My ex-wife Simone sent an email from Paris. "I hope getting your vindication was worth what it cost. Maybe now you can move forward with building something new instead of defending something old." 6 months after the trial, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I reached out to Rousseau and asked if we could meet. He was suspicious initially, worried this was some new legal strategy, but eventually agreed to coffee at the same Park Slope shop where I'd interviewed him before the lawsuit. We sat across from each other and I said, "I want to apologize. Not for defending my technique or for proving your claims were false, but for how I handled the situation. I made this into a war when it could have been a conversation." Rousseau was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I should apologize too. I built my teaching brand on criticizing fine dining without understanding the work that goes into it. I dismissed your technique as pretentious without actually testing whether my simplified version was equivalent. That was lazy and arrogant." We talked for 2 hours about cooking, about teaching, about the tension between accessibility and excellence in food culture. Rousseau admitted that the trial had forced him to reconsider his approach to teaching restaurant dishes. I realized I was being reductive, treating all complexity as gatekeeping instead of recognizing that sometimes complex techniques serve real purposes. We didn't become friends, but we reached an understanding that both perspectives had value, that making food accessible and maintaining technical standards weren't mutually exclusive goals. I offered to do a guest lecture at his cooking school explaining the science behind my octopus technique, and he accepted. That lecture at Rousseau's cooking school felt like closing a circle. I stood in front of 30 students and demonstrated the 3-stage octopus preparation, explaining the purpose behind each step with the same rigor I'd brought to my Michelin-starred kitchen, but without the intimidation that had kept people at a distance. I acknowledged that Rousseau's simplified version was a valid choice for home cooks who didn't have pressure cookers or time to ferment black garlic, but I explained why the additional steps produced measurably better results if you had the resources and inclination. Students asked thoughtful questions, and several said afterward that they planned to try both versions to understand the difference. Rousseau attended the lecture and thanked me publicly for being willing to share the technique instead of guarding it. The lecture was filmed and posted online, getting surprising traction as an example of how culinary conflicts could resolve into education rather than remain stuck in ego battles. I started doing more teaching after that, guest lectures at culinary schools and cooking classes for serious home cooks, finding satisfaction in sharing knowledge that I'd never found in defending my reputation. Dr. Blackwell suggested this might be my next chapter, not running a restaurant, but teaching the next generation and bridging the gap between professional and home cooking. A year after the trial, I opened a small cooking school in Brooklyn focused on teaching professional technique to serious home cooks. The school was deliberately accessible, with scholarships for students who couldn't afford the tuition, and I hired instructors who understood both the science of cooking and the importance of making that science approachable. I called it Cross Techniques, and our first course offering was the charred octopus dish, taught properly with full explanation of why each step mattered and what happened if you simplified or skipped steps. Rousseau sent flowers for the opening, and we maintained a cordial professional relationship, occasionally collaborating on events that brought together different approaches to cooking education. I never returned to running a Michelin-starred restaurant, never sought the stars again, but I found something more sustainable in teaching and in letting go of the need for external validation. The lawsuit had been necessary to defend my professional expertise, but the real growth came after the verdict when I stopped fighting and started building something new. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.